You'll study this lesson with us and understand the basic principles that we want to impart to you. And as the lesson goes on, you'll see why this is important to us in a religious way. 2 Peter 2 and verse 19 might be the passage we would use for a theme, if you want to call it that, and we'll read that later on in our lesson. But first of all, when we talk about communism as a religion, a lot of us think of it as a political entity or political philosophy, but it's much more than that. And it goes back all the way to the beginning of time and the very first temptation that Eve was presented with by Satan, and that was to be like God. In Genesis 3, verses 2 through 5, Satan said to the woman, "Has God said that you can not eat of every tree of the garden?" And she said, "We may eat the fruit of the trees of the garden, but the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die." Then the serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die." And here's our point. "For God knows that in the day that you eat of it, you will be your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." That was the temptation, to be like God, to know something that God knows that is not part of our information. And so there have been many such efforts since the beginning of time, down through history, by people trying to be like God or declaring an independence from God by knowing something that they're not supposed to know. For example, we remember in Daniel chapter 4 that we studied not too long ago that Nebuchadnezzar became so haughty in his spirit and in his mind that he thought he was like God. And in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 30, King Nebuchadnezzar said, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty?" And so he placed himself in the position of God as though he were the sole creator of his kingdom and that it was all up to him. And so there is taking the place of God in one's heart. Israel's separation from God in Hosea chapter 4, verse 1, "Hear the word of the Lord, you children of Israel, for the Lord brings a charge against the inhabitants of the land. There is no truth or mercy," watch this, "or knowledge of God in the land." Israel, God's chosen people, had rejected the knowledge of God in their hearts. And the results are found in verses 2 and following. "By swearing and lying and killing and stealing and committing adultery, they break all restraint with bloodshed upon bloodshed. Therefore the land will mourn, and everyone who dwells there will waste away." God had no choice but to destroy wicked, corrupt Israel, carried them away into captivity, and killed the rest of the people. And the nation never returned to be a nation of God again. All because they had forgotten God and their knowledge and had become so evil and corrupt as a result of it. Well, we see that same scene practiced in Romans chapter 1, where we remember that Paul talking about the decrepit state of the Gentile mind. In Romans 1 and verse 18, "The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness and ungodliness of men who suppress the truth in their ungodliness." And among those things, in verses 21 through 24, the same thing. "Although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, birds, four-footed animals, and creeping things. Therefore God also gave them up to their own uncleanness, in the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever." So you see, down through time, nothing is different with man trying to rebel against God, trying to deny God's existence, trying to declare an independence from God. And so man is ever trying to do that, and really communism is just one more form of that same problem. And so what do we mean by communism? Well, it's not just a political system. It's a life philosophy. It is born of atheism and man's desire to be free from God, just as we've seen in these previous illustrations. The first principle I think that we need to address as a sermon tonight is that communism tries to abolish God and deify man. In a book called Man on All Fours by James Bales, we have this quote from Karl Marx. And Karl Marx said, "Philosophy makes no secret of it. Prometheus's admission, 'In sooth, all gods I hate,' is its own admission, its own motto against all gods, heavenly and earthly, who do not acknowledge the consciousness of man as the supreme divinity." Let that soak in. Read it for yourselves. Communism wants to deify man and get rid of God. The reason why that is Marx believed that God was a creation of man. He blamed the economic system of the Jews for creating their God. And so in Marx's philosophy and thinking, if you change the economic system, then you'll change the nature of man. And in changing the nature of man, you can get rid of God. Again, we read, when man recognizes that he is the supreme being, and when he realizes he has created God only because of his sufferings in this world, he will turn his attention to the abolition of those conditions which made him need the opiate of religion. Again, look at that. When man recognizes that he is the supreme being, well, where did Marx get that idea? From a humanistic, atheistic standpoint. We're all here and we're the greatest evolution of any being that has ever been. That makes man God. And he said when he realizes that he created God because of his own suffering, will eliminate the suffering, therefore you eliminate the need for God and religion. And he calls religion an opiate, a drug. You're high on this need. And how sad that is to take that position. He also said religion is only the illusory sun which revolves around man as long as he does not revolve around himself. Well, those are chilling statements, and yet that's what Marx said about his system of philosophy, his system of government. Communism is based upon Marxism, of course. And here's something we need to keep in mind. Marxism, communism, humanism, Eastern religions, and socialism all have one thing in common, and you see it in all these illustrations. Making man the God. Making this world the only one that really exists. And trying by human effort to make this world a better place. But the key here is when they say make this world a better place, it's make this world a better place either based on Marxist philosophy or communist theory or humanist theory. And so man has to decide what better is, and that's a problem all in and of itself. But now if we do that, let's just imagine for a moment that we begin to practice these doctrines. What does that happen? When man becomes God, this is the only world that we have, and we need to try to make this place a better place. Well, here's what you have as a result. You have man who is absolutely self-centered because there's nothing else there. You have narcissistic tendencies because you're focused on yourself and you make yourself happy and the world is happy. Man becomes very carnal because according to communism, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God. Those are just illusory dreams that we need to comfort ourselves in our misery. And then, of course, that makes us godless. And worse than godless, it makes us anti-God. There's a difference between saying, I don't know if God exists or not, or I don't believe that God exists, and then saying, not only does God not exist, we're going to destroy those who believe that He does. And that's what communism is all about. Well, with all this in mind, keep in mind that communism does the very opposite of what it claims to do. It enslaves people. And all you have to know to believe that to be true is look at the countries that are promoting communism, or have for decades or even 100 years or so. They make the mass of citizens subject to the elite leaders, the, quote, gods of their religion. And for example, China, dictatorship; North Vietnam, dictatorship; North Korea, dictatorship; Russia, a dictatorship, even though it seems to be maxed by some of their different professions these days, but it's still the same thing. All of these countries promote communism, and they're atheistic, anti-God, anti-religion. And so keep that in mind as we go on. The second ingredient of communism that is very dangerous is the demolition of private property. And again, this goes right to the core of what socialism is all about, or Marxism, or communism. You can throw them all together. There's not much difference in philosophy of any of these. But you see, Marx believed that the system of private property, private enterprise, the gaining for oneself, was the cause of all human trouble. Now, I can understand why he thinks that way. There's a rationale that does make sense. And the rationale or the logic of this philosophy says, if you're striving to get more than your neighbor, then you trample on the rights or the privileges of your neighbor in order to get more, and in doing so, you cause conflict and controversy, fighting, war, death. Man's desire to get more at the cost of others seems to be the root of all problems. So logically, you could say, well, that makes sense, and I can understand that. But then he goes to say, remove all private property, and then that will cause man's nature to be changed. He'll no longer be a creature striving to get more, and his environment will become more peaceable because there's no striving to get. And in the socialistic or communistic philosophy, everybody's supposed to get the same amount of everything. Equal distribution of all wealth. And you hear that in our country today under the name of socialism. Socialism is just a milder form of communism or Marxism. So keep in mind, the proof is in the pudding. Let's just take the examples we mentioned. China has eliminated private property. Have they embittered their people? Are the Chinese more free, less desiring of obtaining wealth? And the answer is no. They're suppressed, they're oppressed people. And so communism hasn't worked in China. Well, how about Russia? No, in Russia, people look to America as the example of a great flourishing nation, and they would love to be under a capitalistic environment like this, where you can come and by your own efforts and by your own might and by your own striving, you can make your life better, and you can increase your wealth and your condition in life based on your own efforts. That's what free enterprise does. Russia doesn't have that. They have, again, oppression, slavery. And so the thing they claim they will give us, a calmer environment, a better place, is absolutely not true. And therefore, communism as a theory and as a religion is not true. Well, then we come to the communist initiative. And in other words, how are we going to enact communism in any country that doesn't have it? Well, the first thing they do is try to get the working class to seize power. And what they're really doing is these elite few who are behind the scenes are using the common man to do their dirty work for them. So they say, well, we're going to exalt the working class, so you working class people seize power from whatever government that is there at the time. And then the second thing is they socialize the economy, which is a nice way of saying nobody's going to own any property anymore. It all belongs to, here's the kicker, it all belongs to the government. Who's the government? The elite people who are running the show, the dictators behind the scene. And yet that's supposed to change the nature of man. As we've already pointed out, that's how it's supposed to work. Well, here's what we come up with. They say man is free, but by free they mean he no longer needs the illusory vision of religion, so he's free from religion. Man understands his purpose in life, not to serve God, but to serve socialism, to make your environment a better place to live where everybody loves everybody and everybody possesses the same amount of material, and so there's no striving for more, no cutting throats trying to get ahead. The only problem is, again, that doesn't work, but that's what they mean by man's purpose on earth. And man's nature is changed because he is now living under a rational system of socialism, and that's what they teach and that's what they believe. Well, the object of this lesson is to prove that this philosophy is not true. We've already done so to some degree. And that would say that communism is wrong and religion is not something man invented. It's something that God has given to us because as free moral agents, we are worshipful creatures who look for something to worship. Communism is a false religion because its premise is false. It is based on theory, not fact, and there's no proof whatsoever for it other than brainwashing people to believe that's the case. Whereas Christianity, based on the proofs of the Bible, is in fact the true religion. And communism has no basis for its teaching. God has all authority in heaven and on earth. And so the great conflict between the two, Christianity and communism, should be apparent. Well, communism is wrong in theory, as we've already pointed out, because communist theory says religion is the reflex of a non-socialist society. Well, here's what's interesting about that statement. They say change the system and you change man's nature. Really? Where is that evidence? Where is the proof that says that's true? It's one thing to make a statement. It's another thing to prove that to be true. Well, they say communism is rational. So we're thinking rationally when we think as Marx or as Lenin or as other communist leaders. And, of course, they promote what they call scientific socialism, which sounds like there's some factual information behind their theory that causes them to understand nature and society in a way that makes their decisions God and not us. And therefore, the mystery of life is eliminated. Your whole purpose for being here is to serve the state and to sacrifice your property, your rights, your privilege in order to promote the big government of communism. And therefore, there's no need for religion because, after all, religion is not logical. It's not rational. Religious people are irrational people, they say. But again, what are the results? Let's look at this. If what they said were true, no person under a socialistic government would have any religious consciousness. Now, Russia has been communist long enough, longer than my lifetime, so someone my age could grow up completely under that influence, and what would the result be? Well, the interesting thing is, Valery Tarsis, who was a Ukrainian writer he lived from 1906 to 1983. He was a literary critic and a translator. And he said more than half the churchgoers are young people in Russia. Now, these young people would be the ones who grew up under communism, and yet they're still churchgoers, even though that is not what Marxism and communism wants. They tolerate it, but they don't like it. And so if that's true, then a rational system produced non-rational churchgoers. And if that's the case, then that tells you that socialism is not a rational philosophy, communism is a religion, and it's not a very good religion at that. So, communism assumes the following. They say, let's dethrone God, elevate man to the status of God, and that will be ennobling to man, dignifying to man, and emancipating to man. That's the philosophy they try to embed in the hearts and minds of people in order to get their religion where they want it. Boris Alexandrov, who was a composer, arranger, and conductor in Russia, said this is the social function of atheism. It asserts man's right to be the supreme being, the ruler of the world around him. You see what it's teaching? That's what socialism teaches, by the way. And most of our major universities in America today are being taught by socialist professors, and they're promoting this, and therefore they hate America, they hate capitalism, they hate private property because they have embedded in their minds and the minds of too many students that God and religion are bad and that communism or socialism is good. And that's why we're having this lesson in the first place. But again, what are the results that we see from that? In Russia, man has not been freed but enslaved. Communist doctrine is not something that man's allowed to believe. He's forced to believe it. And number 3, communism tries to fill the void caused by the absence of religion. And that's why young people who've grown up under this philosophy are striving for God and striving for religion and striving to find what they don't understand because they've never been taught it or allowed to believe it. So yes, communism is a religion, and the doctrine behind it is what we call dialectical materialism. Now imagine if we were living in a different time, let's say back in the first century when Jesus lived, if the Sadducees were in charge of religion, and they were to some degree, the temple and the temple grounds. But if they were the ones who could teach absolutely what they believed, then they didn't believe in life after death. They didn't believe in spirits or angels. And so they are materialists just like the communists. And if they were dictators and absolute dictators, they would have enforced that philosophy upon the Jewish society of Jesus' day. Unfortunately for them, they weren't the only body of believers. But dialectical materialism is a substitute for God, which, as I've already pointed out, gets rid of God, gets rid of the idea of heaven or hell, maintains that this world is all the world there is, and that this life is the only life we have, and that our striving for a better life is to be done by sacrificing everything we have for the betterment of everybody else. And so to them, progress is the inevitable result of the clash between the contradictions of life and nature. For example, if you have a capitalistic philosophy, then that's contradictory to nature, and the conflict, the clash between the two is why we have all the problems in the world. So communism says combine better elements and you'll have a better result because conflict will be resolved. But at the same time, they say contradictions in life and in nature are constant, universal, and violent. But this battle between contradictions in this natural environment will eventually result in a higher level of existence. And if you don't recognize that, here's what this is. The same philosophy of evolution that says things in this universe go from a worse state to a better state given enough time, which we know is absolutely false, unscientific, and unfactual. The reality of our universe is that things are going from a better state to a worse state as time goes on. And yet communism adopts the same philosophy. Let's have this violent clash between different kinds, and by the time the clash is over, that which is greater will win out, which in their philosophy is communism or socialism, and therefore the world will be a better place. That isn't factual at all. It is absolutely blind faith in something they cannot prove. But then they say man has the duty to work with these contradictions and actually does so subconsciously, unaware of what he's doing because he's nothing more than a consequence of all the environmental conflicts in the first place. And therefore he's working subconsciously with nature to make it a better place. But again, the proof is in the pudding. What are the results again? Well, they say God is replaced by working for righteousness. And while that sounds good, what they mean by righteousness is making their world a better place, a better society of justice and peace. But they're the determiners of what is just and what is peaceful. I don't think forcing somebody to accept a system they don't believe in creates peace, do you? I don't think that's just, do you? But that's what communism is. It can only thrive under an absolute environment where it is not challenged. They also say man can do nothing to prevent it. But again, it's a forced religion. And they replace a perfect heaven with a perfect earth. Don't need to worry about going to heaven. That's just a dream. That's an illusion. Let's make this world paradise on earth. Well, man has tried that for thousands of years and it never has happened. And therefore, instead of being a slave of God, which they mimic and mock and denounce, but in reality, you've become a slave of the Marxist philosophy. Does that sound like something you'd like to be a part of? Communism violates the basic teachings of heaven itself. Jesus said, "He who is not with me, who is against me, he who does not gather with me scatters abroad." Well, obviously, communism is anti-Jesus. But Luke 10:27, Jesus said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." Now, Marxism might say, yes, I believe that too, but in reality they do not, because they take away man's private property, they take away man's free will, they take away man's eternal soul, saying he's nothing more than the consequence of an evolutionary process, take away man's dream of heaven and his fear of hell, and exalts man as God, which he never has been, never can be, but has always wanted to be. And so the religion of communism, and again we have a quote here from Ed Hunter. He said, "The party must detach one from his former faith in order to get him to accept the communist faith. And it is this communist faith which leads him to be loyal to the party." You see what we mean when we say communism is a religion? It's a philosophy, but it's absolutely a religion. But the Apostle Paul said, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it's the power of God to salvation." Communism says we have to get rid of that horrible thought and realize that the state is going to make your place better and you're God, and therefore you're the determiner of your own fate. But when we look at the results in the communist countries with dictatorships, we don't see that. Again, false teachers are to be avoided according to the New Testament, and we can see why now. And let's go to our passage in 2 Peter chapter 2 that we said would be kind of a theme for our lesson tonight. In 2 Peter chapter 2, beginning at verse 1, it says, "There were false prophets among the people, even as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who bought them, and bring on themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their destructive ways, because of whom the way of truth will be blasphemed. By covetousness they will exploit you with deceptive words. For a long time their judgment has not been idle, and their destruction does not slumber." Now that passage is not referring to communism per se, but the principles are the same. They bring in secretly destructive heresies. In other words, in this socialistic mindset or this communistic mindset, they come in the back door. They try to persuade you that their philosophy is true and that they're trying to make this world a better place and trying to lift you up and elevate you as a God yourself. But when we see the consequences of a long time of that religion practiced in a country, we see slavery by the elite. And so we have to understand what's going on here. It says, "Many will follow their destructive ways. They will exploit you for covetousness' sake by their deceptive words." They say one thing and then do another. And in verse 18 of 2 Peter chapter 2, it says of these false teachers, "When they speak great swelling words of emptiness, they allure through the lust of the flesh, through lewdness, the ones who have actually escaped from those who live in error." Their very concept is to promote the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. And they use that as a hook to grab you and to cause you to say, well, I'm going to go that way because if I don't have God, I can live how I want. I can be the ruler of my own world. I don't have anybody looking over my shoulder. But then it says in verse 19, "While they promise them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption." Nothing left in this life is over. "For by whom a person is overcome, by him also he is brought into bondage." Now, when we give up Christianity for communism or socialism or Marxism, that's exactly what we've done. We've been overtaken by the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. We've been given the illusory dream that we can be gods of our own world. We can determine our own destiny. If you look around us now and you see how much America has progressed over the last 40 or 50 years scientifically and medically and in other ways, but still we're missing out the ability to control our own destiny. We still are very fearful of death. And so we should be. Well, it reminds me of what we saw also in in Psalm chapter 2. Let's go back there. Psalm chapter 2 is a passage on the way that the nations try to destroy Jesus Christ and in effect try to destroy God's rulership. And listen to this. Psalm 2, beginning at verse 1. Why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. There's that independence from God, trying to break free from God as though man could ever do that. And of course, in this context, they're talking about destroying Jesus Christ, both by the Romans and the Jewish nation, thinking if we overthrow God and Christ, then we can have the world for ourselves. But here's the fallacy of every one of these theories that does that. Verse 4 says, he who sits in heaven shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. Then he shall speak to them in his wrath and distress them in his deep displeasure. Yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. Did Rome and Israel do what they wanted to do? Well, they killed the Christ. They thought they threw off the bonds of God's control, but God raised him from the dead, set him at his own right hand in heavenly places. And Jesus said, heaven and earth will pass away, but my word shall not pass away. But that doesn't keep ungodly men from promoting their ungodly theories. And so don't be deceived by that. This is 2,000 years later, and yet the same process is going on under whatever name you want to call your philosophy. And so we have to realize that you and I make the choice as to whether or not we're going to serve God and believe the Bible, which is factual evidence to the truth of the Bible, or accept a philosophy like socialism or Marxism or communism, all of which denounce God, deify man, and promote man as though he were some great being here upon the earth. I know the temptation, especially for our young people, is to feel like, well, socialism is definitely the way to go because it's going to make this world better, and we don't have any of the shackles put upon us by the older people. But again, all you have to do to see the consequences of that choice is look at the countries that have practiced socialism or communism, and you see what an utter failure those countries are. You take away personal property and you take away personal initiative. Yet in 1 Thessalonians 3, the Apostle Paul said, this command we gave you while we were yet with you. If anyone does not work, neither should he eat. You work with your hands to provide for yourselves and your family that which is good, and to give to him who has need. Ephesians chapter 4. Let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor with his hands, that he may have something to give to him who has need. That's God's system. Man labors, he gains, he produces, he shares and takes care of his family, and then gives the extra to those who are in need. That's what we see in the Bible. That's how you love your neighbor as yourself. And that's what the Bible teaches. Well, we could have a lot more to say about the subject of communism, but I wanted to get this basic philosophy before you. Do keep in mind that communists demand submission to their theory. Again, a quote I have says, members of our party should not have any personal aims which are independent of the party's interest. Their personal aims must harmonize with the party's interest. And having heard that, in other words, you have to absolutely submit to the philosophy of communist doctrine. Where's the freedom in that? What if you don't want to agree with that? Are you a slave to communism against your will? Well, what does the book of Romans say about slavery? In Romans chapter 6 and verse 16, it says, "Do you not know that to whom you yield yourselves servants to obey, that one you are the servant to obey, whether of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness?" You see, it doesn't say in the Bible that we have a choice between freedom or slavery. We have to choose what kind of slavery we want to follow. Communism is a very difficult slavery that enslaves people once it gets a death hold upon a country. And that's what I'm afraid of for this country. Christianity makes you better as time goes on because it transforms your mind by the Word of God, which is a high and holy doctrine based upon truth and righteousness and goodness, and saying that God so loved the world that He sacrificed for us. It doesn't say that the world loved God and sacrificed for Him, but we love Him because He first loved us. And so Christianity does teach that we're going to be a slave to something. I'd rather be a slave to righteousness and make myself a better human being than be a slave to something that is evil and corrupt like communism or socialism, any of those doctrines. Again, in Romans chapter 6, remember what the Bible teaches. "Knowing that our old man was crucified with Him, that the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves of sin." When we became a Christian, we denied ourselves. Man is not God. Man is not the master of his own fate. It is not in man who walks to direct his own steps. We admit that and submit to the will of God, but it is a will of love and kindness. Secondly, we've also said we cannot determine our destiny. Therefore, we need God to lead us in His way to heaven, not here upon this earth. And so we sacrifice the longing for this world in order to obtain the heavenly world to come, which is eternal. If we died with Christ, we believe that we shall also live with Him. Romans chapter 6 and verse 8. I appreciate your good attention tonight, and that's the lesson for this evening.